life is going to deal you hardships, period, full stop. That's how life works. And to me, a lot of optimism is about how you deal with those setbacks, how you frame your mindset to get through those setbacks, and then to think about your life on the other side, if you will, if you're ever on the other side of some of these things. I think one of the silver linings of being dealt a tough hand with anything is you come out of it with a sense of empathy for others who are dealing with similar issues.
Hi, my name is Anita Nowak, and I'm the author of this book. Welcome to Season 12 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Bill Burke, who is a former media executive and CEO of the Weather Channel companies. Bill is also the co-author of the 2008 top 10 New York Times bestseller, Call Me Ted, the autobiography of Ted Turner, and co-writer-director of award-winning feature documentary, Live Another Day, about the bailout of the U.S. auto industry. Most recently, Bill was chairman and co-owner of the Portland Sea Dogs baseball team, AA affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. He's a graduate of Amherst College, Harvard Business School, and a 2022 fellow at the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. Bill is a lifelong optimist and launched the Optimism Institute with a mission to inspire people with an optimistic, hopeful vision of the world and its future. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you, Anita. It's a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Me too, because we're going to get to the intersection of optimism and empathy for sure.
Yes.
But
Good.
I'm gonna start from a place of, you worked in the weather industry and the news
Yes.
industry, and we're paying attention to the news, whether or not it's the war in Ukraine or general artificial intelligence coming our way or political polarization. Like, there's a lot of reasons to not be optimist. So I'm
Yes.
curious to know, why are you optimist in the face of all of this?
That's a great question. And I am glad you started with the media, because I think a lot of what we need to work on is our consumption habits. One of the things to keep in mind is that bad news happens very quickly and is easily reported and attracts eyeballs. Good news tends to take a little bit longer to develop. So a lot of the reasons to be optimistic are long-term trends that are not going to be reported, or everyday miracles that aren't reported. As someone said to me, no one stands at the airport and says 1,000 planes successfully landed today,
Right.
or 10,000 people were pulled out of poverty today. Those things are not reported on. And so it's very important for us, I think, to stay on top of the news, be an involved citizen, but at the same time, not let every new data point ruin our day, because those things over time tend to get resolved if we stay active and optimistic. And on that too, one of the things I try to emphasize is people will sometimes roll their eyes when you tell them you're an optimist, but that's largely because a lot of people think optimists just sit there and assume things are going to get better. Quite the contrary. It's my belief that a true optimist is one who gets off their duff, if you will, and gets out and tries to make things better. And I actually don't like the glass half full, half empty. I think that's more about just sort of positivity. To me, an optimist, if the glass isn't full, they're going to finish it and get up and refill it and do something about it to make it better. So it's a long answer to a simple question, but I think it's really important to manage our intake of news successfully and not get overwhelmed by it.
Okay, so that's the thesis. I buy into that. But what about you as a human being, as a person living in an optimistic way? What do you believe is the power behind that?
Oh, I think the power behind it is, without optimism, why do you get out of bed in the morning? I mean, I think it is such a motivation that you're going to get out of bed and make a difference and have a good day and make other people smile. Recently, I interviewed a mutual friend of ours, Drew Villamoria, and she said before she goes to bed at night, her mother taught her this. She asked herself, how many people did I make smile today and how many people did I help? And then she goes to bed. And that kind of outlook, I think, is something that can sustain us in the face of so many tough things that are going on. I'm talking to you today from New York City, where yesterday the sky was orange and it was kind of creepy. But the sense of community as you walked around and everyone looked at each other and said, isn't this kind of strange? And sort of helped each other out. And I don't know. There was actually a weird sense of collective empathy, probably, that was going on, even in the face of something like that.
Okay, so you are on a mission, clearly, believing that we need more optimists in the world. So what's your goal with the Optimism Institute? Sounds like an exciting project.
Yes, I'm realistic about it. It's not gonna be a light switch effect. I hope that over time, though, and I'm already seeing this, particularly through the podcast, people say, gosh, the more I listen to this, the better I feel about things. And one of the things I'm really hopeful about is I'm hoping to reach more young people. I have two kids in their 20s, and I get really discouraged about how down that generation tends to get. And I think one of the problems, too, about obsessing about current events is we don't realize how much better things are from recent history. I just gave a speech at a high school and I reminded them, my grandfather fought in World War One. His son fought in World War Two. My dad fought in Korea. I mean, this is the past generations have not had it so easy. And so my hope is to help people put today into context. Um, Steven Pinker calls it hindsight bias, where we look back at the good old days and they weren't, as Billy Joel says, the good old days weren't always good. And I think that's really important. So that's what I'm hoping to do. I'm a history buff. I think Kevin Kelly, the great technophile entrepreneur, he said, if you read only the news, you'll think that things have never been worse. But if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better. And so I'm trying to convey that to folks and ask them to pause and think and change their mindset. And I do think there'll be ripple effects from that hopefully I can put some dent in the way people are feeling about the world.
Well, since you've talked about young people, I mean, your children are the same age as my undergrads, and I've
Mm.
noticed over the last 10 years, whether it's climate, what is it called, eco-anxiety, or just
Yes.
the sense of the the kind of late stage neoliberal capitalism doesn't make sense to them anymore. Like the crazy
Yeah.
extreme wealth inequality doesn't make sense, and how divisive, it is to have a conversation with someone. You can hear one idea about something and then you can actually assume a bunch of things about people, right? And sort of like
Yes.
off whole swaths of people, which is not very helpful when you're trying to collaborate against these big things like climate change, for example. One of the things that has come to my mind that I feel is an important lever, maybe towards optimism as well, is agency, where I feel like we're
Yes.
not really developing young people to feel like they have capacity, they have agency to make things happen. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. 100%. And again, back to the improvements we've made over time, they didn't just happen. And I talked about this to these young high school students the other day. It's like, okay, when I was graduating from high school, the Berlin Wall was still up, apartheid was in place, AIDS was ravaging the gay community, and we didn't even know what the heck it was. And, one by one, these things have actually been largely resolved. And how did that happen? Well, it was scientists, it was politicians, it was protesters, it was boycotters. I mean, when I was in college, the issue was divestment from South African firms, to end apartheid. Guess what? We ended apartheid. So I don't know why there's the sense that they're lacking agency because, they're not, in my view. And getting out and voting and protesting and raising hell, that makes a difference. I mean, it's social issues. When I was in high school, the idea that same-sex marriage would be the law of the land in the United States ever, let alone, hopefully early in my lifetime, never would have believed that. How did that happen? It
Hmm.
was people speaking up about it. So I totally agree that this is happening, and I find it a little disheartening. Um, and that's again part of what I hope to do is to explain to people that the world continues to improve, and it's not by accident, it's by activity and people being involved.
Yeah, okay, and not to come in and sound like a skeptic or a cynic, because that's
No,
not my MO, but like it's almost, I don't know, what's the expression where you've got like one that pops up and you pop it down and one that pops
whack a mole.
a whack-a-mole. So I'm thinking
Yeah,
for every positive forward-looking trend that you've just described, gay marriage being the one that you just mentioned, we've got the Supreme Court, and not to get deep into politics here, but you've
no,
got
it's
like
fine.
women's rights now being, pulled back.
Yeah,
So it seems as though, okay, so it's not all bad, but it's also not all good. Um,
no,
and I wonder whether or not I get asked the question a lot, is empathy something that we're born with, or is it something that we can build or develop? And I have my answer to it. I'm just curious to know about optimism the same way. Like if you've done any of the research or your own experience, like were you born optimistic? That's just your mindset, or is this
Yeah.
something you can cultivate?
I'm a firm believer that the latter is the case, that it can be cultivated. I think I compare it sometimes to athletics too. So I, grew up playing baseball. I could have worked all I wanted on baseball. I wasn't going to play in the big leagues. You're born with a certain amount of skill or ability or outlook and your upbringing, and then you can work on the margins. I think with optimism, though, it is a choice. And I haven't done the research, but I've read a lot from people who have, who would support that notion. And yes, for everything that pops up, it is like whack a mole, but I prefer the analogy. I think Barack Obama said this a few years after he left office, where he felt like a lot of what he had achieved may have been undone. But it's sort of the 3 steps up, 2 steps back, right? And there's a net gain of a step. It takes time, but we get there. And so, like you said, gay marriage, and now there's all kinds of LGBTQ backlash. But I feel like it is a net gain as we move forward, and that's history. That's how it's always been.
Mm. And it reminds me of this book that Jeremy Rifkin wrote called The Empathic Civilization, where he talked about how when there's two meta trends of new technology for communication and new technology for energy, when those two systems meet, humanity catapults to like a new level of consciousness. And he goes through history, right? And
Yeah,
now at a stage where we've got the internet and all of the ways of being in touch digitally, which has really flourished over the last 2 decades. And then sort of we're at the tail end of let's say, the carbon economy, but still that ushered in like amazing advancements. But
right.
it's come at major costs. And the question he asks, which is sort of the ominous question for the end of the book, is will we get there in time? So I
Yes.
feel like there's enough newsworthy like people saying we got to pay attention to AI. This is as big an existential threat as nuclear, as anyways, you know what I'm saying. So
Yes, I
you
do.
still believe in the face of all of these daunting conversations that optimism is the only way we can transcend this?
Absolutely. I do. And technology is a great one to talk about. Kevin Kelly, back to him. He describes technology caused yesterday's problems. Technology is solving yesterday's problems. And as we do that, technology that we're using to solve is probably causing some problem down the road, but that's how it goes. And again, it's gradual progress. So, like you said, the Industrial Revolution lifted people out of poverty, built economies, and it also created a lot of carbon, and it's causing today's problems. We are coming up with technologies right now at a breakneck pace to address climate change, some that we can't even dream of, and AI might even play a role in all of this. So all of these things are progress. I love to challenge people to think about too, as awful as the COVID pandemic was, imagine if it had happened in 1975.
Right.
No internet, 4 channels of television. You know, the economy would have stopped. Deaths, who knows how many. We'd still be working on a vaccine. Okay. So these things, you and I are talking right now via an interface that we hadn't heard of 4 years ago. I don't know when Zoom was created, but I know it was before the pandemic, but barely. It's caused it. It's again, the pandemic was a terrible thing, but it was better, less bad than it would have been. Forget the 70s, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of that as we move forward.
I love that. I love that. Hey there, I don't mean to interrupt a fabulous conversation. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are so many other great conversations on my YouTube channel. Over 120 episodes with already 25,000 views, completely organic. Thanks to you, my listeners, viewers, watchers. Please subscribe. The world needs more empathy, and you have a role to play. Okay, so I said at the top end that we would talk a little bit about the ways in which optimism and empathy kind of align or intersect. So what do you think is the connection?
Well, I think there's probably more than one, but one that I thought of in thinking about speaking with you is that, life is going to deal you hardships, period, full stop. That's how life works. And to me, a lot of optimism is about how you deal with those setbacks, how you frame your mindset to get through those setbacks, and then to think about your life on the other side, if you will, if you're ever on the other side of some of these things. I think one of the silver linings of being dealt a tough hand with anything is you come out of it with a sense of empathy for others who are dealing with similar issues. So, for example, my family dealt several years ago, right before the pandemic, for 3 years. We had a niece who developed a rare, not too rare, but a difficult form of leukemia, and she passed away at 29. It was awful. I just talked to my sister just now, the mom of this lovely young woman, and she said every day it's something. But we all have developed a sense of empathy for other folks going through similar issues that while I wish we I wish we didn't have to pay that price to get here, it is a pretty wonderful thing to when you hear about someone else having similar struggles to have a sense of empathy, to know when it's helpful to reach out, to know what to say and not to say to someone going through the same thing. It's a really valuable, I think, uh, thing to have coming out of these inevitable, difficult things you're going to experience. My father-in-law just passed away. I lost my dad 10 years ago. I have a sense of empathy for what my wife and her family are going through that I would not have had if this was the first death in my family, someone close to me. So I think that's just one. I'm sure there are others, but that was the first thing that came to me when I thought about that for talking to you today.
I think the other thing probably worth underscoring is, I talk about purposeful empathy because we all have the
Mm-hmm.
capacity for empathy, but the question is, do we actually leverage it? Do we actually activate it? And I think in your case, we all have the capacity for optimism. The question is,
Sure.
we decide to lean into that a little bit, right?
Yeah, and yes, and also, you talked before about these things that are coming at us all the time, and we're in these camps, and these people are evil because they're on this side of the issue, and I'm good because I'm on this side of the issue, and every once in a while stepping back and taking an empathetic approach and saying, okay, why do they feel so strongly about this? Let me walk a mile in their shoes. Or, why was someone so strident against this Supreme Court nominee because they may have had a sexual assault in their background? Well, maybe someone in their family was sexually assaulted and they know what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they're so worked up about it. Maybe to me, that's a form of empathy that can help you understand these divisions that we have. And I think also back to political divisions or any divisions, is starting a conversation, trying to lay out all the things on which you agree. And that list is going to be way longer than you probably expect going into that interaction. And when you're done with that, the things that you don't disagree on feel like exceptions
Mm.
and not the only thing that you're focused on when you sit down to talk to somebody. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think that kind of walk a mile in someone else's shoes is a really valuable exercise, and to me, that's a form of empathy.
So I imagine that there are some skeptics out there that saying, how Pollyannish. Like I get asked the question, do I really think that empathy is going to be a useful, you know, way of mitigating against these crazy things that are going on in the world? And I often say my husband is from Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia, where Russia invaded a few
Yep.
years ago, and he's watched in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine. And we're hearing about what's going on in Sudan, and the
Yeah.
homeless population is growing. So, I mean, there's all these things going on, and it would be unfair to say, oh, let's just show up with more empathy towards these people. Like that's not good enough. But then what my counter argument is, if you look at across time, whether or not it was abolition or suffrage or civil rights or LGBTQ rights, like all of it required intentional, purposeful empathy as a movement, coalesced to create positive change in the world. So yes, it is important. It's necessary for the social change that we need. So what do you say to the skeptics, especially when it comes to mental health? I imagine that you run into
Yes.
problems because it's like, oh, just be happy, just be optimistic when you're in the
Yeah.
face of like people with major issues like depression and other mental health issues.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I I commend you and appreciate you referring to history when you talked about that. Because again, I think really understanding what the past has truly been like. And one of the reasons I encourage people to study, I'm in the United States, study some of the worst parts of our history. Don't be shy about it because we have made progress. We are nowhere near that perfect union that we're trying to work towards, but we've made progress. I would also say that my approach is not that optimists are always happy or things are always great. In fact, it's a huge struggle a lot of the time. I'm also very self-conscious because I come at this from, I'm privileged in just about every way you could possibly be privileged. And so I'm sure there are people like, well, of course he's optimistic. He's got it made. Um, but I've had some hardships too, and I am trying to tell stories about folks who've had it a whole lot tougher than I am, but still try to find that hope and optimism going forward. So, sure, I mean, there are always going to be terrible things going around the world. We should be aware of them. We should vote accordingly. We should speak up and protest when we can. But day to day, between now and the end of the day, I'm not going to make an impact on what's going on in Sudan. I'm just not. I should care about it. If there's an issue I can support or a cause I can support, that's great. But in the meantime, in my circle and the people I pass on the street today, and the guy at reception when I walk out and tell him to have a good night, all of those things I think create ripples that will make this a better place to live. I believe very deeply in that.
Mm-hmm. You have a your own podcast called Blue
I
Sky.
do.
I'd
I
love to
do.
hear why you called it Blue Sky and what the goal of the
Sure.
podcast is, and some of the conversations that you've had.
Yes, it is called Blue Sky, and it's available wherever you get your podcast. I called it Blue Sky because, well, it's funny. You work on a podcast. Boy, there sure are a lot of them out there. A lot of the names I thought about were taken, but I landed on Blue Sky because there's a meditation prompt that I know at least that says there's always blue sky above. Sometimes you just got to get your head above the clouds to see it. And to me, that sort of gets to sort of the essence of optimism, that we are going to have clouds. We're going to have smoky days. We're going to lose loved ones. Awful things are going to happen, but how we can find that blue sky somewhere and get back to it and get above the clouds. That's why I came up with the name. And people seem to be responding, and it's only 2 syllables, so that works. And so I'm talking to people from all walks of life. It's been one of the real pleasures of it, and trying to talk to people who are working on really tough challenges. Back to, these aren't people who are just sitting around with a smile on their face all day and waiting for the world to get better. They are working on homelessness. I did an interview yesterday with a man who almost lost his son to addiction and suicide, who has come out the other side more empathetic, spending his life working to help other families in this situation. I'm talking to researchers, people who've written books, social entrepreneurs like Giroux, who we mentioned before, people working on really tough societal issues, but coming at it with a sense of hope and optimism that I find infectious, and trying to tell their stories to others, I think, is a way to put a little dent in the world's mental health and outlook.
Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed then so far, back in the day when I started the podcast, I think my primary goal was, I knew my book was coming out and my agent was very clear on, grow your platform. So I thought, okay,
Sure.
I'd probably do podcast interviews. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
And now I would do it even if I just love doing these interviews because it always leaves me in my day feeling a little bit recharged and refocused on what matters to me with the multiple inboxes and stress of life. So you have found the same. I think at the very onset you were saying that you are hoping to also be a space to counter all the negative news. So I wonder if you
Exactly.
could speak to sort of the actual goals that you have with the Optimism Institute and the podcast. Like, who are you trying to reach? What are you trying to do? Are you doing like courses? Are you training, or what's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I come at this with great humility, and the name Optimism Institute is somewhat tongue in cheek because you are zooming with the entire institute right now. But I do have ambitions, and I do have ways I want to grow this. So I'm starting with the podcast and social media. And so on the social media side, in addition to promoting the podcast, I'm trying to pepper the feed with data on how the world's improving with inspirational quotes. And there's other folks doing this. I'm not particularly unique in this, but that's one of the things I'm trying to do. And then I'd like to grow this in a couple of ways. One is I love to do public speaking, and whenever I talk to people about this subject, there is a reaction. And I mentioned I spoke to a high school graduation. It was a real honor, but there was a real reaction. I've heard from several parents. I don't know how much it landed with the 18-year-olds, but the families and the people in the audience, it did, and that encourages me. So whether it's corporate offsites or events where I could help speak to people, I'd like to do that. And again, there are other people in this space, and ultimately, I'd love to evolve this into the Optimism Alliance and work with these other folks to sort of lift all of our boats. We're all making small differences. I think if we could collaborate a little bit more and amplify our efforts, that would be a worthy goal. So my first podcast came out in March. I'm just getting going with this, but I got to tell you, I've never had more fun or felt like this is what I'm meant to do right now than working on this. And like you, it absolutely holds my feet to the fire to keep an optimistic outlook. If I get down, my wife will be like, "Aren't you the optimism guy?" And so I think it's helpful to come back to this work. And likewise, it's helpful for people just out there to come back to more positive news and outlets online and podcasts and that sort of thing.
Beautiful. Love it. Okay. Well, the last question I love to ask my guests, Bill, is if they can think of a time in their life when they were on the receiving end of empathy, and what that meant for you.
Yeah, I'm sure there's several. I come back to, and I'll go back to, for me, some of the toughest things I've experienced is losing loved ones. And we all deal with that. And my dad had an outsized influence on my life, like a lot of dads. And when he died, it was the first time I'd really lost anyone close to me. And I got a condolence letter. I'd always been raised, write letters, go to the funerals, write condolence letters. No matter how many they get, they're always appreciated. So I would do that, and who knows. And then I was on the receiving end. And one came in through the fog. This woman I have tremendous respect for. Her name's Susanna, and if she's watching, she'll know who she is. And I've repeated this advice to others. She said to me, I remember what it was like when I dealt with this, that, and the other. The best advice I got was to take time to grieve and find that space, because the world pressures us to get back to normal. But this advice helped me more than any other I ever got, and blah, blah, blah. So to me, that was this, and it made it so much easier for me. And I don't know if this is a guy thing or a achiever thing, but I was like, I got to get back to normal. Okay, my dad passed away. We're done with the funeral. Let's go. But I felt like I was driving 35 miles an hour on a 70-mile-an-hour highway. But getting this letter from this woman I respected that said the best advice I ever got was to take time to grieve was huge. And I've put that same line, the best advice I ever got was to take time to grieve. I put that in almost every condolence letter I've written since, and I've had people thank me for it. So that's one that I remember. And back to ripple effects, I hope that advice that I've simply passed along has helped other people too.
Thank you for sharing that. Bill, tell me something about your dad before we leave.
Oh, my dad was a wonderful guy. He was a great dad. He was tough. He was a very successful business person, but one of those guys who very quietly did incredible things for people. Some I knew about when he was alive, more I learned about after he died. My sister heard from a friend and said, "Oh, I'll never forget what your dad did for my brother Billy." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Well, he paid for his college." Like, what? A guy who'd lost his dad. He's one of those kind of people. We were close, although his temper and toughness created that distance. But in his later years, he softened and had a lot of dementia and stuff. But he was a wonderful man, and so much of what I do. The other thing I learned before I'd lost someone, people would say, I think about them every day after someone died, and I'd roll my eyes to myself and think, no, they don't. Yes, they do. I've thought about my dad every day for the past almost 12 years. You just did it again. And to me, that's one of the great things you learn when you lose somebody, is that something about them is always with you. And that's something I carry forward with my dad.
Thank you for sharing that.
You bet.
Well, Bill, I've enjoyed this conversation. I love what you're doing. I believe
Thank you.
I'm actually interviewing someone in Canada who also has joy in the title, so maybe
Yes.
we'll package
Good.
this, and I'll introduce you possibly.
Yes.
I've thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation. I want to thank everybody who's been watching and listening. We'll see you next time at Purposeful Empathy.
And Anita, we are going to reciprocate, and I hope you'll be on blue sky before you know it.
With pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you so much for watching an episode of Purposeful Empathy. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe to the channel and also consider picking up your copy of Purposeful Empathy. It's an invitation to dial up empathy in your life. The world needs more empathy. We need more empathy. What are you waiting for?